In 1942, the American government led an assault against its own citizens based solely on skin color. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, America removed and imprisoned all Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. No trials were held, no evidence of wrongdoing was produced, but in the name of national security, the American government acted against its own citizens by directing the greatest occurrence of racial profiling in America's history. Law-abiding Japanese American children, women, and the elderly were rounded up along with their husbands, brothers, and fathers and held against their will. This is their story of inequality, as their dreams were destroyed because of the color of their skin by the very government whose job it was to protect them as citizens. In 1885, the first Japanese immigrants landed on the shores of America. Americans were looking for cheap labor and welcomed the newcomers. As more Japanese moved to America, President Theodore Roosevelt negotiated the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan in 1907. In return for Japan's refusal to issue passports to America, the United States agreed to not openly discriminate against the Japanese. The Gentleman's Agreement allowed wives of those who lived in America to enter the country, so many Japanese women came to America as part of arranged marriages, which were common in Japan. These picture brides flooded the West Coast to join their spouses. As the population of Japanese immigrants increased, so did racial tensions. Within 2 years of the Gentleman's Agreement, California began introducing anti-Japanese legislation. The Alien Land Law of 1913 limited the rights of Japanese-born immigrants from owning land, and in 1922, the Supreme Court ruled that Japanese immigrants could not become American citizens because they were neither white nor African. Even Japanese children faced racial discrimination when they were forced to attend segregated Oriental schools. Racial tensions reached an all-time high in 1924 when America violated the Gentleman's Agreement by completely outlawing all immigration from Japan. Japanese Americans lived with discrimination until America was forever changed.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Following Pearl Harbor, Americans feared more attacks. The United States believed that it was patriotic to distrust all Japanese Americans. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. President Roosevelt was influenced by his top advisors, Lieutenant General John DeWitt and Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Both men believed that all Japanese were a threat to national security and could be spies. As shown in pink, Executive Order 9066 authorized the creation of military zones that could exclude any person when necessary for the national defense. This order did not specifically talk about Japanese Americans, but in practice, only people of Japanese descent were excluded from military zones and required to relocate. In all, over 110,000 Japanese Americans living on the West Coast relocated. 70% were American citizens. They received notice of their relocation by reading flyers that hung on telephone poles. Japanese Americans had only a few days to sell all of their possessions before leaving their homes and businesses. Evacuating meant selling quickly and at a huge loss. They were told to only pack what they could carry, including bedding, clothing, and toiletries. The Japanese Americans did not know where they were going or how long they would be gone. They were loaded onto buses and trains and transported to temporary assembly centers, while the War Department created movies showing Army officials happily loading belongings onto buses. This isn't how the Japanese were actually treated.
I was 4 at the time of Pearl Harbor, and I was too young to really understand what was going on. But I still do remember that day when armed soldiers with guns, bayonets on them, came to our home to order us out. I remember that as a very scary day. And, you know, a child can sense your parents' anxieties.
The assembly centers were located at racetracks, fairgrounds, and other public facilities. At some, internees were housed in animal stables that had 1 week earlier held animals.
We were put in stables and not in apartments like she was saying. And all we had was hay. Like she said, we stuffed our own mattress and pillows or whatever. We had to make our own. And it smelled like a stable, too.
Japanese Americans were later moved to more permanent homes known as relocation centers. Relocation centers were located in harsh climates and were under military guard. They were fenced in by barbed wire.
So they called them relocation centers. They were America's versions of concentration camps.
Not all Japanese Americans willingly relocated. Fred Korematsu was a Japanese American who refused to report to an assembly center. He was arrested for violating military orders. The Supreme Court heard his case in 1944 and upheld his conviction. The court ruled that any law or order that discriminates because of race is constitutional if it serves an extremely important government purpose. The court believed the government's evidence that any Japanese person could be a spy, so the court ruled that the government's discrimination of the Japanese was justified to protect national security. 40 years later, reports were found that the evidence the government produced was not true. Japanese Americans were never a threat to national security. In 1983, Korematsu's conviction was overturned, but the rule of law still stands. The government may discriminate against its citizens when it serves an extremely important purpose. In 1946, the last internment camp in America was closed. Upon their release from the camp, internees were given a train ticket and $25. No apologies were given. No reparations were made. Internees were simply released back into mainstream society. In 1980, President Carter and Congress created a commission to investigate internment. The commission's report found that the internment was unjust and recommended that the government issue an apology, give $20,000 per internment survivor, and create an educational trust fund just for descendants of the attorneys. On August 10, 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which carried out these recommendations. In addition, Presidents Bush and Clinton also formally apologized in written letters to the survivors of internment. Today, it seems obvious that America's treatment of the Japanese during World War II was wrong, but the question remains, have we learned from the mistakes? On September 11, 2001, America was once again violently, intentionally, and surprisingly attacked when terrorists used planes as weapons and killed more than 2,700 people. In response to these attacks, President George W. Bush declared a war on terror. In November 2001, President Bush signed a military order allowing military tribunals to judge suspected terrorists. The president's order said that an extraordinary emergency exists for national defense purposes because of the 9/11 attacks. Civil liberties groups worried that the suspected terrorists could be held indefinitely, and if tried, the trials would be held in secret. President Bush argued, like the government did under President Roosevelt, that these actions were required for national security purposes. The argument was brought before the Supreme Court, who ruled that the president cannot deny suspected terrorists due process. The Supreme Court invalidated the military tribunals and made it harder for President Bush to fight the war on terror while ensuring that the liberties of the Constitution are not easily trampled, even in wartime. This is a much different result than during World War II, and so it appears that as a country we have learned our lesson. While all governments make mistakes, the strength of every government is whether it learns from them. During times of war, the line between national security and citizens' rights under the Constitution can be blurred. While Japanese internment camps are a dark spot in America's history, they serve as a reminder that the rights of citizens will sometimes conflict with the responsibility of government to protect itself from attack. When this happens, may the Constitution become a beacon of light instead of a source for racial discrimination.